tell you more about it if you're interested. We have an amazing collection of books, archives, pamphlets, and journals. And we're in the process of reorganizing and renovating and overall remodeling and the physical plant and cleaning, all kinds of things. If you know other groups who are interested in renting a space for a meeting, there's this room, and then there are 2 smaller rooms upstairs for a group of maybe up to 20, and there are tables up there. And there's a $50 donation for rental, whether it's a 1-hour, 2-hour meeting or an all-day meeting. And we have to pay for the lights and the building and everything, so I'm going to pass this around as a little incentive if you can help out this library. We appreciate it very much. Well, Roger, come on in. And then I'm going to introduce, Grover wants to make the first donation, he told me.
Yeah. Well, I've been here several times before, and I always make a donation of $100. It's a very good place. Very good resource for you all to have, and I wish we had something like this.
So while the
Jersey, this is great.
I'm beginning to think you've got a job.
So while the basket circulates, and then I'll pick it up at the end, I'm going to introduce Raj Sahai, who will talk about Grover and introduce him. And Grover will speak about 45 minutes, and then we'll have it open for discussion and Q&A. And the time, we're not restricted to 3:30. We can stay longer if people wish. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Bonnie.
And see me afterwards if you know any groups who might be interested in renting the place for meetings. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Bonnie, and for this opportunity for me to introduce Grover. I'm not the most qualified person to do it. There are many people here who are veterans of the struggle much longer, but I feel most passionate about his work. And the reason is this. I was born and raised in India, as many of you know, and so I was born around the time India gained independence, and I grew up understanding what imperialism had done to the country in which I was raised. There was a lot of poverty, and there was no prejudice against the USSR in India at that time. There isn't that much now, but Indian government was close to the USSR. They had.
Could you speak up a bit, please?
Yeah, the Indian government had close ties with the USSR. The USSR was a strong supporter of India, even though India was ruled by the bourgeois class, but it was a progressive bourgeoisie. And so, as such, there was not a tremendous propaganda. When I was 21, I came to University of Illinois as a student to study engineering, and then I went on to work in Chicago area, and I was amazed at how much of what opinion young people and older people had about the USSR. Their view was completely opposite of mine. Even the workers I met in Chicago were anti-communist, and I wondered how was this achieved. And then later on, I met communists who called themselves communists, and they believed in the same thing. So that somehow Stalin was a monster, and everything happened under Stalin, which actually was a period of 1924 to 53 when he died, was actually very negative. This is the impression they have created. Books after books, all the journalists, the writers, the news commentators in the United States present that view, and what I found amazing is that a good section of those who call themselves leftists and communists also believe in something similar. Okay, their critique is from the left, they say, but in fact, they repeat the same things. So I was very excited when I came to a presentation, first lecture that I saw Grover here was a couple of years ago on
2011.
yeah, on when he wrote the book Christian Life, and I was amazed. The room was full upstairs, and I was amazed to hear somebody's actually gone and from the archives interpreted what I understood to be the truth when I was growing up. I didn't have that many details. And then his book on Kirov. And all these years I have interacted with part of the left that calls themselves Trotskyists or left communists, and have debated with them. And I found they have the same line as the imperialist writers have on the regime, and workers' regime in the Soviet Union. So I'm very, very honored to have been given a chance to present Grover Furr today. And his two books are over there, Christian Light and The Murder of Sergei Kirov. And his third book, which is about, which I think you will talk more about, which is not available today because something went wrong with printing.
I'll talk about that.
You will talk about that. So, without taking more time, Grover Furr.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today. I'm very, very glad to see you all. I would like just to take a minute to say that I'm I feel especially honored that Professor Michael Parenti has attended. I never met him in person, but he's certainly one of the great Marxist historians in the United States.
I heard there was
during
free
the past,
coffee, so
during the past several decades, and I've used his books many times, given them, used them in my classes, and so I'm very glad Mr. Parenti feels special, but I'm very glad to see all of you here, okay? So we're
Free coffee.
So I'm going to read this talk. I think it goes better. It's shorter, it doesn't ramble as much, you know. I'm going to read it. And at the end of that, we will have some time for a Q&A. I will talk about my books. And then after the Q&A, my good friend, Ellen Murray, who lives not far from here in Oakland, invites all of you who wish to come back to her home for some refreshments and to have some discussion. So I think that's very nice, and I'll give you the address and everything at the end of the Q&A. Okay, so that's a wonderful thing that Ellen has done. So let me begin, and after that we'll have the Q&A session. I call this Exposing the Anti-Stalin Myths of the Cold War. Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands. As many of you know, I have specialized in Soviet history of the Stalin period for many years. And for the past 9 years, I have done this virtually full-time, aside from my teaching. My talk today is based on my new book. The full title is, this is what it looks like. The full title is Blood Lies, the evidence that every accusation against Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union in Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands is false. Plus, there's a subtitle, what really happened in the famine of 1932-33, the Polish operation, the Great Terror, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the so-called Soviet invasion of Poland, the Katyn massacre, the Warsaw Uprising, and Stalin's supposed anti-Semitism. Blood Lies, my book, is a very thorough examination of Yale professor Timothy Snyder's dishonest work, Bloodlands. Its subtitle is Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. Published in 2010 by Basic Books, New York, Snyder's Bloodlands is the most widely known and by far the most successful book to date to attempt to equate Stalin with Hitler, the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany, and communism with Nazism. It has received many awards and prizes and has been translated into 26 languages. Snyder himself is a public intellectual whose essays frequently appear in journals like the New Yorker Review of Books and the Times of London, and he has been writing quite a bit about recent events in the Ukraine, for example, always taking the Ukrainian nationalist side. When I first encountered Snyder's Bloodlands, I immediately recognized on the basis of my prior research that a number of the so-called crimes and atrocities which he alleges against Stalin and the Soviets are untrue. In plain language, they're lies. Discussion with friends and colleagues assured me that Bloodlands is indeed influential and important anti-communist work whose claims have received wide acceptance. I decided to systematically check every single piece of evidence, footnote, documentation, that Snyder cites to attempt to prove any crime, atrocity, or wrongdoing by Stalin, the Soviet leadership, or pro-communist forces. At that point, I had been studying allegations of crimes by Stalin and the Soviet leadership of his day for about 6 years. I thought that I would be able to prove that some, perhaps much, of what Snyder alleges was false, anti-communist, anti-Stalin lies. I also thought that I would finally find evidence of some crimes, atrocities, or wrongdoing by Stalin and the Soviets. After all, Snyder has a phalanx of professional anti-communist researchers to help him. Most of them are from Poland and Ukraine, countries where the pro-Soviet nationalist mythology is based on anti-communist lies. Others are German, French, and Russian. I had to learn Polish and Ukrainian, at least a reading knowledge of these, in order to do the research necessary for this book. I already knew Russian, German, and French. I thought, surely this team of highly motivated anti-communist researchers, with the resources of their national governments, archives of original sources, and universities backing them up, would have uncovered at least a few crimes of Stalinism. Right? I was wrong. What I discovered was that of the dozens of allegations of crimes and atrocities in Snyder's book, not a single one of them is true. Either Snyder's evidence does not in fact support the claims he makes, or Snyder cites secondary sources that make these claims, but the statements of those secondary sources are either not supported by evidence, or once again, the evidence they cite does not support their conclusions. In many cases, Snyder and the anti-communist researchers upon whose work he relies are guilty of bias or omission, of remaining silent about evidence that refutes their fact claims, but that few people know about. Blood Lies, my book, is 588 pages long. That is because I reproduce the primary source evidence that I cite in the original language, Polish, Ukrainian, or Russian, together, and some French and some German, together with my own English translations. This has made Blood Lies significantly longer than it would have been. But it is essential to include this evidence. One of the most important lessons of my research on the Soviet history of the Stalin period is this. There is so much dishonesty, so much deliberate deception in the citation of primary source evidence by anti-communist historians that no historian of this period should be assumed to be honest. All primary source evidence must be checked. Naturally, this means that I cannot ask readers of my book to simply accept my conclusions either. I must make available to my readers all the primary source evidence so they can study it for themselves. And this is what I've done. Snyder and other anti-communist and anti-Stalin historians do not do this because they cannot do it. The evidence simply does not support their anti-communist, anti-Stalin claims. So in their footnotes, they refer to hard-to-find documents in rare collections, or secondary sources in Polish or Ukrainian in hard-to-find journals. And when you find those articles, they often have no primary source evidence, or just have further citations to yet other hard-to-find books or articles in Polish and Ukrainian. In short, it's like the old-fashioned confidence game called the shell game. Remember that? With the evidence playing the role of the P. Under which shell is the P? The answer is under none of them. There is no P. No evidence to support Snyder's anti-communist, anti-Stalin claims, or those of many other researchers of his ilk. Bloodlands, Snyder's book, is a completely fraudulent book. Not a single allegation of crime, atrocity, or misdeed of any kind. Come in, please. The misdeed of any kind on the part of Stalin, the Soviet Union, or pro-communist forces holds up. My research completely dismantles Snyder's invidious comparison of the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany and Stalin with Hitler, and proves that Snyder's book is based upon lies, pure and simple. There's some seats up here. Pardon me?
People don't want to sit in the front?
Well, there's some good seats over here.
Yeah.
In addition to alleging dozens of crimes, supposedly crimes of lesser scope, Bloodlands focuses on 6 major ones. They are collectivization and the famine of 1932-33, the so-called Holodomor, the terror famine, right? The Great Terror or Yezhovshchina and the Polish operation within the Yezhovshchina, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the alleged Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939, the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, and Stalin's alleged anti-Semitism. I discuss all of these allegations in detail in my book with full reference to the best contemporary scholarship. These historical falsehoods are the subject of this presentation, that is my talk today. These falsehoods are so widespread that many persons on the left believe them. They have been promoted very strongly by anti-communist scholarship for many years. So I'm going to discuss those major topics. 1. Collectivization and the famine of 1932-33, what really happened? This is a brief account of the 1932-33 Soviet famine as supported by the primary source evidence now available. It is mainly based upon the research of Professor Mark Tauger of West Virginia University. Tauger has spent his professional life of more than 20 years studying famines and is a world expert on Russian famines. And in case you wonder, he's not a leftist of any kind. No flavor. Famine has struck Russia hundreds of times during the past millennium. A 1988 account by Russian scholars traces these famines through historical records from the year 736 AD to 1914. Many of these famines struck Ukraine as well. According to Tauger, quote, the Ukrainian famine of 1928-29, not the one of 32-33, was the third famine in the Soviet Union in 7 years due to a natural disaster and was the most extreme part of a broader food supply crisis that affected most of the country. The Soviet Union clearly had an extreme vulnerability to natural disasters, and Soviet leaders interpreted this vulnerability as a sign of agricultural backwardness. There are seats up front, if there are none back there.
There are extra chairs over there. For Soviet leaders, the Ukrainian famine was an important part of the argument that Soviet agriculture had to be changed, in quotes. The collectivization of agriculture was designed to end the cycle of famines that had tormented Russia and Ukraine for centuries. It was a reform, a significant improvement in the security and lives of the peasantry, and therefore of its entire population, because the rest of the population depended upon the peasantry, right? It was not undertaken to tax or exploit the peasants or to extract value from the countryside. On the contrary, during the decade from 1929 to 1939, the Soviet government spent tens of billions of rubles on agriculture. Quoting Tauber again, their primary goal was increasing food production by using what seemed to be the most modern and reliable methods available at the time. End quote. Stalin and the Bolsheviks viewed collectivization as the only way to swiftly modernize agriculture and put an end to the wasteful and labor-consuming cultivation of individual land holdings, often in tiny, widely scattered strips. The Bolsheviks used large-scale, highly mechanized agriculture of certain American farms in the West as models for the Soviet farms. The famine of 1932-33. Two incorrect explanations of this famine are widely accepted. Ukrainian nationalists claim that Stalin and the Bolshevik leadership withheld grain from Ukrainian peasants in order to export it, deliberately starved Ukrainian peasants to suppress Ukrainian strivings for independence, or both. This is the myth of the Holodomor, consciously modeled on the Jewish Holocaust. It originated in the anti-communist Ukrainian diaspora after the Second World War. These forces had fought on the side of the Nazis and had fled to the West with German troops as the Red Army advanced.
A more mainstream but still politicized interpretation states that the famine was due to the collectivization of agriculture and excessive grain requisitions, which led to disruptions, mismanagement, peasant rebellions, and ultimately to famine and starvation. This is the official position of the Russian government and of those anti-communist scholars who do not accept the Holodomor myth. Neither of these explanations is borne out by primary source evidence. The official position of the Russian government and academic establishment is similar, that the famine was caused by excessive grain requisition and by collectivization. This hypothesis is erroneous. According to Mark Taubert, quote, "The severity and geographical extent of the famine, the sharp decline in exports in 1932-33, seed requirements, and the chaos in the Soviet Union in these years all lead to the conclusion that even a complete cessation of exports would not have been enough to prevent famine. The harvest of 1932 essentially made a famine inevitable." End quote. The reality is that collectivization put an end to famines in the Soviet Union. Except for a serious famine in 1946-47, Wheatcroft, the author of the most recent study of this latter famine, has concluded that this famine too was due to environmental causes, and of course, the significant destruction caused by the war. But basically, 1932-33 was the last famine. 2. The Yezhovshchina and Polish operation. What really happened? We know now from primary source evidence that Nikolai Yezhov, the Commissar of Internal Affairs, that is to say essentially the Minister of the Interior, acted directly against Stalin's and the Soviet leadership's intentions. We now have the telegram sent on June the 17th, 1937, just prior to the June 37 Central Committee plenum, in which Yezhov transmits the request of S.M. Mironov, NKVD chief in Western Siberia, reporting the threats of revolts by subversives in concert with the Japanese intelligence. In it, Mironov reports that Robert Eicke, first Secretary of Western Siberia, will request the ability to form a troika to deal with this threat. Apparently, Eicke, and then a number of other first secretaries, approached Stalin and the Politburo after the plenum and asked for special powers to deal with conspiracies, rebellions, and revolts in their area. This led to the Politburo decree, quote, on anti-Soviet elements of July 2nd, 1937, which authorized all first secretaries to arrest kulaks and criminals who had returned to their areas, shoot the most dangerous of them, and exile the rest to other areas. This vision of organized internal revolts in conjunction with foreign powers, Japan in the case of Western Siberia, occurred in the context of the Tukhachevsky affair, or military affair, of less than a month earlier. In that case, the top commanders of the Red Army were convicted of collaboration with foreign powers and a plot to overthrow the Soviet government. The loyalty of the military commanders was in grave doubt, rightly so, as we now know. The NKVD appeared to be the only force that Soviet power could rely upon. It did not become clear until much later that Yezhov, head of the NKVD, himself was conspiring with foreign powers to overthrow the government and party leadership and was using massive executions of innocent people to stir up resentment. For the next year or more, Stalin was flooded with reports of conspiracies and revolts from all over the USSR. A large number of these have been published in Russian. Undoubtedly, a great many more remain unpublished. It is important to ideologically anti-communist researchers that these mass murders be seen as Stalin's plan and intention. Anti-communist Russian researcher Vladimir Nikolaevich Khaustov is honest enough to admit that the evidence does not bear this out. He admits the existence of a major conspiracy by Yezhov and concedes that Stalin was deceived by him. Khaustov admits that Stalin acted in good faith on the basis of the evidence presented to him by Yezhov, much of which must have been false. Yezhov also admits this in the confessions of his that we now have. Okay, 3. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. What really happened? The truth is, you will be surprised to hear, that the Soviet Union did not invade Poland in September 1939. However, so completely has this non-event passed into historiography as true that I have yet to find a recent history book in the English language that gets this correct. Of course, the Soviet Union had never been an ally of Nazi Germany. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a non-aggression pact, not an alliance of any kind. The claim that the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany were allies is simply stated over and over again by Snyder, but also by others. But it's never backed up with any evidence. The complete text of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is online. It is short. Anyone who reads it can see that there is no alliance of any kind. The secret protocols to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not plan any partition of Poland. The Soviets wanted to protect the Soviet Union, and therefore to preserve an independent Poland. The point here was that if the Polish army were beaten by the German army, it and the Polish government could retreat beyond the line of Soviet interest into the Soviet sphere of interest, Eastern Poland, and so find shelter, since Hitler had agreed not to remain further into Poland than that line. From there, the Polish government could have made peace with Germany. The Polish state would have still existed. The Soviets did not do this out of any love for anti-communist and anti-Soviet Poland. The Soviets wanted a Polish government, any Polish government, as a buffer between the Soviet Union and the Nazi armies. The betrayal by the Polish government of its own people frustrated this plan. The Soviet Union did not invade Poland, and everyone knew it at the time. How do we know this interpretation of events is true? I have 9 points. The Polish government did not declare war on the Soviet Union. 2, the Polish Supreme Commander ordered Polish soldiers not to fight the Soviets, though he ordered Polish forces to continue to fight the Germans. 3, the Polish president, who had fled to Romania in September 17th, tacitly admitted that Poland no longer had a government. 4, the Romanian government tacitly admitted that Poland no longer had a government. 5, Romania had a military treaty with Poland aimed at the Soviet Union, yet Romania did not declare war on the Soviet Union. 6, France did not declare war on the Soviet Union, though it too had a mutual defense treaty with Poland. 7, England never demanded that the Soviet Union withdraw its troops from western Bielorussia and western Ukraine, the parts of the former Polish state occupied by the Red Army after September 17, 1939. On the contrary, the British government concluded that these territories should not be a part of any future Polish state. 8, the League of Nations did not determine the Soviet Union had invaded a member state. 9, all countries accepted the Soviet Union's declaration of neutrality. I have all of that documented, of course, in the book. In 1958, in the journal Soviet Studies, UCLA professor George Ginsburg published an article examining the Soviet Union's claim of neutrality in the German-Polish War. With reference to international law and the statements of the parties at the time, Ginsburg concluded that the Soviet Union was indeed neutral and that this neutrality was internationally recognized. Without a government, Poland as a state had ceased to exist under international law. This fact is simply ignored by Polish nationalists and by anti-communists generally, for whom it is highly inconvenient. The Soviet position was valid under international law. In a second article in the American Journal of International Law, Professor Ginsburg determined that the Soviet claim that the state of Poland no longer existed was basically a sound one. To quote Ginsburg, quote, "De facto, then, one may well accept the view that the Polish government no longer functioned as an effective state power. In such a case, the Soviet claim that Eastern Galicia was in fact a terra nullius, land belonging to no one, may not be unjustified, and could be sustained." Ginsburg continued, quote, "Theoretically, the Soviet Union still retains a better claim than Poland to the incorporated territories," that's Western Ukraine and Western Bielorussia, which used to be Eastern Poland. "Theoretically, the Soviet Union still retains a better claim than Poland to the incorporated territories on the basis of the principle of national self-determination, if the ethnic composition of the area's population is taken into account. For, though the Soviet title rests on a plebiscite of doubtful validity, the Polish one derives from a direct act of force and from military conquest, not even remotely claiming parentage with the concept of self-determination." 4, the Katyn massacre. What really happened? Anti-communists claim that there is a historical consensus about the Katyn massacre issue. This is not true. Rather, anti-communists accept without question the version that blames the Soviets for all the shootings and demands that everyone else do so as well, or the anti-communists will call them nasty names. In normal historical discussion, it is considered essential to outline the disputes and